lesson we're going to talk about asexual reproduction. So, the first type of asexual reproduction is called fission. And we have different types of fission. The first one is called binary fission. Binary fission. And what happens over here is, if there's an organism, let's take an example. So an example is amoeba. So if there's an amoeba and this divides into two, so that's why it's called binary fission. So it's somewhat like this. And then this particular amoeba again divides into two, this way. This is what happens in binary fission. The next type of fission is called multiple fission. So what happens in this type of fission is an organism divides into multiple organisms. So unlike binary fission, where an organism divides into two offsprings or two amoebas or two organisms, in multiple fission the organism divides into multiple organisms. So what happens here is, we can take an example, plasmodium, and we know that plasmodium is a causative agent of malaria. So if this is the organism, let's take plasmodium, and then what happens is the nucleus, so if this is a nucleus, the nucleus divides, so there are multiple nucleus in this cell, in this particular cell, there are multiple nuclei, so multiple nuclei, there are many nuclei. The next step is the cell remains the same, and then the nucleus, nuclei, and then what happens here is there's a layer which is formed around the nucleus like this, another layer, and this is the cell membrane. This is the cell membrane of the nucleus, of the particular nucleus that we're talking about. So gradually this cell membrane disappears, and then these cells somewhat look like this. They look like this. When the cell membrane of the original cell disappears, they somewhat look like this. So this is what happens in multiple fission. Example is plasmodium. So the next type of asexual reproduction is called budding. This is called budding, and we have two types of budding. We have exogenous budding and endogenous budding. As the name suggests, exogenous budding is the budding where the bud is formed on the outer side. It's formed on the outer side. Whereas in endogenous budding, the bud is formed on the inner side. It is in the inner side. And the buds that are formed on the inner side are called, there's a special name for them, they're called gemmules. We can take examples of exogenous budding and endogenous budding. For exogenous, we have example yeast. So yeast is an example of endogenous budding. And for endogenous budding, we have one sponge, which is the only freshwater sponge, which is spongilla. This is you can write it here, it's the only freshwater Sponge. This is the second type of asexual reproduction, which is budding. So we have exogenous budding and endogenous budding. Exogenous budding is where the bud is formed on the outer side. Example is yeast. Endogenous budding is where the bud is on the inner side, and the buds have a special name here. In endogenous budding, they're called gemmules, and examples are spongula. Spongula is the only freshwater sponge. These are the two types of asexual reproduction. Now let's move on to the third one. The third one is called spore formation. Spore formation. As the name suggests, spores are formed in this kind of asexual reproduction. The first type of spore formation is by formation of zoospores. As the name suggests, zoo is something related to animals. Animals are motile, so these zoospores are also motile because they have flagella. We can take example as Chlamydomonas. The next type of spore formation is by formation of conidia, and conidia are non-motile. But not motile. Example, in some types of fungi like penicillium, conidia are formed in fungi. Example, penicillium. This is the third type of asexual reproduction, spore formation. Zoospores and conidia. Zoospores are motile. Example, Chlamydomonas. Conidia are non-motile. Example, penicillium. The fourth type is called fragmentation. And in this type of asexual reproduction, there is this special function called regeneration. Examples, Spirogyra, which is a plant. And in case of animals, we can take the example of Planaria, flatworm, and this is an animal. So this is one type of asexual reproduction. The fifth type is called plasmotomy. So this is the fifth type of asexual reproduction. Now, example is Pelomyxa. And the special thing about this particular organism, Pelomyxa, is that it can have over 1,000 to 2,000 nucleus. So it can have more than one. The usual number of nucleus is 1, but in case of Pelomyxa, there are like 1,000 to 2,000 nuclei. First, let's understand what is plasmotomy. Plasmotomy is the division of plasmodium of a protozoan it's the division of plasmodium of a protozoan into 2 or more multi-nucleate parts. So basically what happens here is there are multiple nuclei which are being formed. So into 2 or more multi-nucleate forms. Instead of 2 or more, we can write multiple. Multiple nucleate parts, which means multiple nuclei. So in plasmotomy, division of what exactly is plasmotomy? It's division of plasmodium of a protozoan into multiple nuclei. This is what plasmotomy is. So the example we took is about Pilomixa, and the special thing about Pilomixa is that it has over 1,000 to 2,000 or more than that nuclei. This is the special thing about, or the unique thing about Pilomixa. So we talked about 5 different types of asexual reproduction. The first one is about fission, and fission is, we have binary fission, we have multiple fission. Example of binary fission is amoeba, and for multiple fission we have plasmodium, which is the causative agent of malaria. The second one is called budding. We have endogenous budding and exogenous budding. So in exogenous budding we took an example of yeast, and for endogenous budding we took an example of the only freshwater sponge, which is spongilla, and we talked about gemmules. The third one is spore formation. Here we have zoospores, motile, example is Chlamydomonas. Conidia is non-motile, example is Penicillium. Fourth one, fragmentation, example Spirogyra, which is a plant, and there's a power of regeneration here. And Planaria is an animal, and it's a flatworm, and it's an animal. The fifth one is plasmotomy. Here, example is Pilomixa, which has over 1,000 to 2,000 nuclei. And what exactly is plasmotomy? It's the division of plasmodium of a protozoan into 2 or more multinucleate parts. Multiple nuclei are being formed. This is another mode of asexual reproduction. So in this video, we talked about asexual reproduction and its types.